Chapter 1. The New Assignment. The job posting had sounded too good to be true. High pay, full benefits, free lodging, and a luxurious estate. It was the kind of opportunity someone in my position couldn't afford to question. After a messy fallout with the police force and a string of dead-end jobs, I was desperate. The description was vague: caretaker needed for private property, discretion required. But when I saw the paycheck, I didn't hesitate to apply. It wasn't until I arrived at the estate that I realized what I'd signed up for. Diddy's mansion loomed in the distance as I drove up the winding driveway, the sprawling estate framed by towering iron gates and meticulously manicured hedges. The place screamed wealth. Massive columns, pristine white walls, and windows that seemed to stretch up forever. But there was something else, too. An oppressive weight hung in the air, like the mansion itself was alive, watching me. Just nerves, I muttered to myself as I parked the car and stepped out. The interior was even more extravagant. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, their lights casting a soft golden glow on the marble floors. The walls were lined with priceless paintings and statues, each more imposing than the last. Every detail was carefully curated to impress, to overwhelm. Yet, beneath the luxury, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Welcome," a sharp voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to see a wiry man in a crisp suit striding toward me. His face was sharp and angular, his eyes cold and calculating. "Name's Harris," he said without offering a handshake. "I'm your supervisor. Follow me." Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. As he led me through the labyrinthine hallways, he rattled off a list of my duties: routine maintenance, keeping an eye on the property, and ensuring that guests stayed within designated areas during events. Simple enough. But then, as we passed a heavy wooden door tucked into the corner of a hallway, Harris stopped abruptly. "And one more thing," he said, his voice dropping into a low, serious tone. "Stay out of the tunnels." I frowned. "Tunnels?" "Beneath the estate," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "Don't go near them. Don't open the door. Don't even think about it." Before I could ask why, Harris turned and continued walking, leaving me standing there with a chill creeping up my spine. That night, I began my first shift. The mansion was eerily quiet after dark, the grand halls stretching endlessly into shadows. I carried a flashlight, though the faint glow from the chandeliers above provided just enough light to navigate. As I walked the corridors, my footsteps echoed off the marble floors, each sound amplified in the silence. At first, everything seemed normal, a bit too normal. The estate was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. Not a single piece of furniture was out of place, not a speck of dust to be found. But then, as I approached the far end of the east wing, I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. I stopped, my flashlight beam darting across the hallway. The sound was coming from behind a door, the same heavy wooden door Harris had warned me about earlier. The rational part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, to chalk it up to the creaks and groans of an old house. But something about the sound held me in place. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. I shook my head, snapping myself out of it. "It's nothing," I muttered, backing away. "Just your imagination." Still, I couldn't shake the unease. As I continued my rounds, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The next morning, I sat in the staff quarters, nursing a cup of coffee. Harris walked in, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "Everything goes smoothly last night?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. "Uneventful." He nodded, though his gaze lingered a second too long, as if he didn't quite believe me. "You'll get used to the place," he said, almost as an afterthought, before walking out. But would I? The mansion wasn't just unsettling. It felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper of wind through the halls seemed deliberate, as if the house itself was testing me. And no matter how much I told myself otherwise, I couldn't ignore the growing certainty that something was lurking beneath the surface. That night, the whispers returned. I was walking through the West Wing when I heard them again. Faint, but distinct. This time, they were accompanied by something else. Footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the same direction as before. From the basement door. Stay out of the tunnels. Harris's warning echoed in my mind. I gripped my flashlight tightly, debating whether to investigate or walk away. My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone, but my curiosity was stronger. Taking slow, cautious steps, I approached the door. The air grew colder with each step, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the rest of the mansion. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The whispers stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the silence was absolute. Finally, I stepped back, my heart still racing. Whatever was behind that door, I wasn't ready to find out. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake, that whatever was down there knew I was there. Chapter 2. Strange Occurrences begin. The days fell into a monotonous rhythm, but the strangeness of the mansion never left me. I woke early, grabbed a quick breakfast in the dimly lit staff kitchen, and began my rounds. The mansion was a maze, with twisting hallways and endless doors. The air was perpetually heavy, as though the walls were holding secrets too big to share. The staff was another oddity. The workers were polite but distant, always focused on their tasks. They moved in perfect silence, their faces neutral, their eyes avoiding mine. It felt like they were there only in body, their minds far away. No one lingered for conversation, and every interaction was brief, almost rehearsed. One morning, while cleaning the area near the West Wing, I noticed something strange etched into the underside of the staircase. It was a symbol, crude, drawn in what looked like ash or charcoal. It resembled a jagged circle with smaller, angular marks within it. I knelt down to examine it more closely, but before I could touch it, a shadow fell over me. I turned to see one of the gardeners, Raoul. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the handle of his rake. "Don't ask questions," he said, his voice low and hurried. "Just do your job and you'll stay safe." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving me staring after him. His words lingered like a warning I couldn't shake. Later that day, the atmosphere shifted. A large delivery truck arrived, and workers began unloading crates and boxes, carrying them into the mansion. I wasn't allowed near the truck, but I caught glimpses of what looked like vintage wine crates covered in dust. By the afternoon, the staff was bustling around in preparation for a high-profitable party. Guests began to arrive as the sun set, their luxury cars gliding up the driveway and disappearing into the underground garage. The guests were dressed to impress, suits that probably cost more than my yearly salary, women draped in diamonds and silk. They moved through the mansion with an air of superiority, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. But there was something else about them. Their faces seemed too perfect, their smiles too wide. They interacted with one another, but their conversations felt hollow, like they were reciting lines from a script. As the night wore on, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Near the basement door, the same one Harris had warned me about, there was another symbol, this one drawn with more precision. It matched the one I'd seen earlier under the staircase, but this time it looked fresh. like someone had just placed it there. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Maria, the cook, walked past me on her way to the kitchen. She paused, her eyes darting to the symbol, and her face tightened. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but stopped herself. Without another word, she turned and hurried away. Around midnight, the party's energy shifted. A group of 6 guests, led by Diddy himself, broke away from the main hall and headed toward the basement. They moved quietly, their faces expressionless. I watched from the shadows, my heart racing. The basement door opened and they slipped inside. The door closed behind them with a soft click and the hallway fell silent. When they returned hours later, I was still lurking in the area, pretending to dust a nearby vase. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They moved like marionettes, their steps too deliberate. I didn't know what had happened down there, but it wasn't normal. The mansion was quiet by the time I finished my rounds. Most of the guests had left, and the staff was cleaning up the remnants of the lavish party. I walked the halls, my footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. As I passed near the basement door, I heard it again. Whispers. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound was faint, almost too faint to hear, but it was unmistakable. Low, rhythmic chanting, punctuated by what sounded like muffled cries. I pressed my ear to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers grew louder, the words indiscernible, but filled with an unsettling urgency. I backed away, my skin trickling with dread. Whatever was happening down there, I wanted no part of it. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Door. I told myself I wasn't going to think about the basement. I wasn't going to think about the whispers, the blank faces of those guests, or the symbols etched into the walls. But no matter how hard I tried, the thoughts crept back in, filling the empty moments of my day. That nagging curiosity turned into something heavier, like a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. The more I avoided the basement, the more I felt its presence looming over me. It wasn't just a part of the mansion. It was the heart of it, a dark secret pulsing beneath the surface. While organizing supplies in one of the offices, I stumbled upon an old map of the estate tucked between stacks of yellowed papers. The map was hand-drawn, detailed, with winding lines and neatly labeled rooms. One section caught my attention immediately. Tunnels. Restricted. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I traced the lines with my finger, noting how the tunnels sprawled out like veins beneath the mansion. Some areas were marked with strange symbols, similar to the ones I'd seen around the house. Others had no labels at all, just blank spaces that hinted at something hidden. I folded the map and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't know why I took it, but some part of me knew it might come in handy. That night, as I made my rounds, the mansion felt different. The air was thicker, the shadows longer. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old building seemed to have a sinister edge. When I passed the basement door, I froze. It was ajar. A faint chill crept up my neck as I stared at the door, the darkness beyond it seeming to stretch endlessly. My flashlight flickered as I reached out, hesitating before pushing the door open further. The staircase descended into pitch black, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with ancient stone, damp and uneven. It felt more like the entrance to a cave than a basement. I took one step down, then another, the wooden planks creaking beneath my weight. The whispers I'd heard before were faint, like they were coming from deep within the tunnels. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but the pull was stronger. My heart raced as I stepped further, the air growing heavier with each movement. The map burned in my pocket as if it were begging to be used. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against stone. It was close, too close. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The sound grew louder, accompanied by what I could only describe as a low growl. Fear gripped me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping on the stairs as I retreated. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands trembling as I locked it. And the next morning, as I grabbed my gear from my locker, I felt a chill run down my spine. Tucked between my belongings was a small, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully, my pulse quickening as I read the scrawled message. The handwriting was rushed, shaky, like whoever wrote it was desperate to get the message across. I looked around the room, but it was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Later that day, Harris, one of the other night guards, approached me. His face was pale, his expression tense. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You've been poking around where you don't belong," he said, his voice low but firm. I tried to play dumb. "I don't know what you're talking about." He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me. I've been here long enough to know the signs. You've felt it, haven't you? The pull." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Harris leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Once you go down there, you're never the same. The things you see, the things you hear, they stay with you, and they don't let go." "What's down there?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to overhear. "It's not just tunnels," he finally said. "It's something older, something that doesn't belong in this world. Stay out, or you'll regret it." As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned a corner, I swore I heard footsteps echoing behind me. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift, even when there was no light to cast them. The staff, usually so aloof, now avoided me entirely. Maria wouldn't meet my eyes, and Raul barely nodded in my direction. It was like I'd become invisible, or worse, a walking target. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The note, the map, Harris's warning, it all churned in my mind, creating a storm of fear and curiosity. I clutched the map in my hands, tracing the lines again, my eyes lingering on the labeled tunnels. I knew I should burn it, forget I ever found it, but deep down I also knew I couldn't. Chapter 4. Into the Depths. The storm rolled in just after midnight, shaking the mansion to its core. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled through the long hallways, drowning out the usual creaks and groans of the old building. For once, the whispers from the basement seemed muted, almost swallowed by the storm's fury. I sat in the security office, staring at the stolen key in my hand. My fingers traced the cold metal edges, my thoughts a mess of fear and curiosity. Harris's warning rang in my ears. "Once you go down there, you're never the same." But the pull was stronger now, an almost physical force that made it impossible to ignore. Something was down there, something no one wanted to talk about, and I couldn't take another sleepless night wondering what it was. Taking a deep breath, I stuffed the key into my pocket and left the office. The hallway leading to the basement was darker than usual, the flickering emergency lights casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The door loomed ahead, heavy and foreboding. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the key. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if trying to drown out my thoughts. "This is stupid," I muttered under my breath. But I couldn't turn back now, not after everything I'd seen and heard. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing the staircase I'd glimpsed before. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow wooden steps that descended into the unknown. The tunnels were unlike anything I'd expected. The walls were made of rough stone, their surfaces etched with carvings that seemed impossibly old. Symbols I didn't recognize covered every inch, their intricate designs glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight. The air grew heavier with every step I took, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. It smelled metallic, like rust and blood, and every breath felt thick, almost syrupy. The deeper I went, the more the whispers returned. They were faint at first, like distant echoes bouncing off the stone walls. But as I continued, they grew louder, more distinct, voices layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It felt like the tunnels were alive, their narrow passageways twisting and shifting as if they were leading me somewhere. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a larger chamber. My flashlight flickered, its weak light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room was dominated by a massive wooden table, its surface scarred and stained. Around it were melted candles, their wax pooled like blood on the floor. Strange masks hung on the walls, their empty eye sockets staring back at me. On the table lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn. The pages were filled with symbols and diagrams, their meaning lost on me. Beside the book was a ceremonial knife, its blade still smeared with dried blood. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch the knife, but I stopped myself. Something about it felt wrong. The air in the chamber was oppressive, suffocating. It felt like the room itself was watching me, judging me for being there. And then I heard it. Footsteps. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew louder, closer, until it echoed through the tunnels like a drumbeat. Panicking, I ducked behind one of the stone pillars that lined the chamber. My flashlight flickered again before sputtering out, leaving me in near total darkness. The footsteps stopped at the entrance to the chamber. I held my breath, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. A faint glow appeared, illuminating the figure that entered. They were hooded, their face obscured, but their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. Behind them, more figures followed, each carrying something. A candle, a bowl, a small wooden box. They moved in unison, like they were part of a choreographed dance. My stomach churned as the first figure approached the table, placing their hands on the book. They began to speak, their voice low and guttural, the words unfamiliar but heavy with meaning. The others formed a circle around the table, their heads bowed. The air grew thicker, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I tried to stay still, but the tension was unbearable. My muscles ached from holding my position, my hands slick with sweat. Then the first figure pulled back their hood, and my heart stopped. It was Diddy. He walked calm, almost serene as he flipped through the pages of the book, his lips moving in time with the whispered chants of the others. His presence filled the room, commanding and terrifying all at once. He reached for the ceremonial knife, holding it aloft as the others began to chant louder. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, their power palpable. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this a ritual? A sacrifice? I didn't wait to find out. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, I made my move. Crawling on hands and knees, I inched toward the exit, praying I wouldn't be seen. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached the doorway, I heard it, a voice, low and cold, cutting through the chants like a knife. What was there? I froze, my entire body going rigid. The room fell silent, the oppressive air thickening until it felt like I was being smothered. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Find them, the voice commanded. Footsteps echoed again, louder this time, closing in on my hiding spot. Somehow I found the strength to move. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted down the tunnel, the sound of pursuit hot on my heels. The walls seemed to close in around me, the carvings glowing brighter as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the staircase, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for air, my back pressed against the cold wood. I'd seen enough, more than enough. And now I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening beneath this mansion, it wasn't meant for human eyes. Chapter 5: The Secret Network. Back in my quarters, my hands trembled as I locked the door behind me. The leather-bound book felt heavier than it should have, its weight pressing down on me like a burden I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. I sat at the small desk, the dim light from the overhead bulb casting shadows on the cracked leather cover. For a moment, I just stared at it. The grotesque scene in the tunnels played over and over in my mind. The chanting, the artifacts, the unmistakable presence of Diddy. The book was the only tangible proof of what I'd witnessed, but opening it felt like crossing a line I might never come back from. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and flipped open the cover. The pages were filled with tight, spidery handwriting, the ink dark and slightly smudged in places. Some sections were written in English, others in symbols or languages I couldn't even begin to decipher. It wasn't a journal. It was something far more sinister. A manual, perhaps, or a guide. The first few pages detailed rituals, their purposes outlined with an unsettling precision. One described the transfer of power, requiring offerings of blood to ensure loyalty and obedience. Another detailed a rite of protection, said to shield participants from exposure or betrayal. The language was cold and clinical, but the implications were horrifying. Then there were the coded notes. At first glance, they seemed like random sequences of letters and numbers, but the patterns suggested something deeper. They were connected. Routes, locations, maybe even dates. One phrase stood out repeatedly: the balance must be maintained. As I flipped through the pages, I stumbled upon a folded piece of parchment tucked between two sections. Carefully unfolding it, I realized it was a map. The map was old, its edges frayed, and the ink had faded in places, but the layout was unmistakable. It detailed the tunnels beneath the mansion in intricate detail. My stomach turned as I traced the lines branching out from the central chamber. The tunnels weren't just confined to the estate, they extended far beyond, connecting to various points across the city: warehouses, high-end clubs, even a seemingly innocuous office building downtown, all linked by this underground network. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the scale of what I was looking at. This wasn't just about Diddy or the mansion. It was an entire operation, sprawling and hidden in plain sight. The tunnels were arteries, pumping whatever darkness I'd witnessed in the chamber to locations where power and influence thrived. I snapped the book shut, the sound echoing in the tiny room. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I'd learned. This was bigger than I'd ever imagined, bigger than anything I could have prepared for. The knock on my door jolted me back to reality. It was soft at first, then more insistent. My heart leapt into my throat. No one ever came to this part of the quarters unless they had a reason. I hesitated, debating whether to stay silent, but the knock came again, accompanied by a voice. "Miss Maria, please, open the door." Maria was one of the cooks, her normally cheerful demeanor a rare bright spot in this otherwise suffocating place. But her voice now was different, low and shaky, tinged with fear. I opened the door a crack, keeping my body tense and ready. Maria slipped inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder before shutting the door behind her. "You have to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're talking about you." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. She wrung her hands, her eyes darting to the closed book on the desk. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't. The staff knows it, and they're watching you. They're scared, but not of you. They're scared of them." "Who's them?" I pressed. Maria hesitated, her face pale. "The ones in the basement. The ones who run all of this. You don't understand, Michael. They see everything, hear everything. If they find out what you've seen, what you've taken, you won't make it out of here alive." Her words sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Why are you telling me this? Why not just look the other way like everyone else?" She hesitated again, then sighed. "Because I've seen it. Not all of it, but enough to know what happens when someone gets too close. You think you're curious, but they'll destroy you for it. I've seen people disappear, staff members, guests, gone without a trace." Her voice broke, and I could see tears welling in her eyes. "I can't watch it happen again. Not to you. Please, just leave. Forget about all of this. It's the only way you'll survive." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to listen to her, to pack my things and get as far away from this place as possible. But another part, a darker, more stubborn part, refused to let go. "What if I can stop it?" I asked, my voice low but firm. Maria's expression darkened. "You can't. You're one person against something far bigger and more dangerous than you can imagine. You don't fight them. You run, and if you're lucky, they let you go." She stood abruptly, brushing away the tears on her face. "I've said too much. Just be careful. If they suspect you, it's already too late." Before I could stop her, she slipped out of the room, the door clicking shut behind her. I sat there in silence, staring at the book and the map. The weight of Maria's warning pressed down on me, but so did the realization that I was in too deep to walk away. My mind struggled to focus. The walls seemed to close in around me, the faint hum of the mansion's generators sounding almost like whispers. The book, the tunnels, the rituals. I couldn't ignore them anymore. This wasn't just about survival. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. Our luck lasted. Chapter 6. The chase begins. The unease started small, a pen out of place, a drawer left slightly open. At first, I thought I was imagining things. After all, I hadn't exactly been sleeping well since discovering the book. But soon, it became undeniable. My belongings had been tampered with. Someone had been in my quarters. I found my duffel bag unzipped one morning, its contents rifled through. Papers were shuffled, items missing. A sudden chill ran through me when I noticed the book, hidden beneath the loose floorboard, was untouched, but slightly out of position. Whoever had been in my room knew what to look for. They had come close. Too close. The mansion itself seemed to turn against me. Cameras that I'd never paid attention to before now seemed to track my every move. Their lenses whirred faintly, swiveling as I passed. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following me, unseen but ever present. During one of my shifts, I noticed two guards whispering in the hallway. They stopped abruptly when they saw me, their expressions stiff. One of them, Harlow, a man I'd never trusted, watched me with an unsettling intensity as I walked by. It was clear now. They knew I was onto something. The final straw came during a routine patrol. I turned a corner in the grand hall, and there he was, Diddy. He was standing near a towering mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with deliberate precision. I hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge him or turn back. But before I could decide, his eyes met mine in the mirror's reflection. They rested there. "You've been busy," he said, his tone casual but laced with something darker. "I'm just doing my job," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Diddy turned to face me, a faint smile playing on his lips. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Some truths," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "are better left buried." The words hit me like a slap. My mouth went dry and my heart raced as he turned and walked away without another word. That night, I decided I had to leave. Staying wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. I packed what little I had, carefully tucking the book and map into a concealed pocket in my jacket. Moving through the mansion under the cover of darkness, I avoided the cameras as best I could, sticking to blind spots I'd memorized during my shifts. The main gate was heavily guarded, but I'd anticipated that. My plan was to slip through the smaller side entrance, used mostly by staff during deliveries. But as I approached, 2 guards stepped out from the shadows, their expressions grim. "Where do you think you're going?" one of them asked, his voice cold. I froze, trying to come up with an excuse, but it was clear they weren't interested in my answers. Before I could react, one of them grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back. "Let's take a walk," the other said, his grip like a vice as they began dragging me back toward the mansion. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let them take me back. I had seen too much, and they knew it. Desperation kicked in, and I drove my elbow into the ribs of the guard holding me. He let out a grunt, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I bolted, adrenaline coursing through me as shouts erupted behind me. I sprinted toward the back of the estate, my mind racing. The only place I could go now was the tunnels. The stolen map burned in my pocket as I reached the hidden basement door. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking, and shoved it open just as the guard's footsteps grew louder behind me. The air in the tunnels was colder than I remembered, the walls slick with moisture. My flashlight flickered as I descended, the narrow passageways swallowing me whole. The echo of my own footsteps was deafening, and every shadow seemed to lurch toward me. Using the map, I navigated deeper into the maze-like tunnels, trying to stay ahead of my pursuers. I could hear their muffled voices above, their heavy boots stomping against the stone. But soon, their voices faded, replaced by something far worse. Whispers. They were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind, but they grew louder the deeper I went. Layered and dissonant, they seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then came the footsteps. They weren't like the guards. These were lighter, quicker, darting back and forth in the darkness, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I whipped the beam around, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was following me, but the tunnels remained empty. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that froze the blood in my veins. I pressed on, the walls closing in around me as the air grew heavier, more oppressive. The map showed an exit not far ahead, but the whispers and footsteps seemed to close in, their presence suffocating. At one point I rounded a corner and nearly slipped on the damp floor. As I steadied myself, my flashlight illuminated something that made my stomach churn. A bloody handprint smeared across the wall. The growl came again, closer this time. I turned off the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My breath was shallow as I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were almost a chorus, each voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then, silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity before cautiously turning the flashlight back on. The beam flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced along the walls. I crept forward, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But there was no going back now. Finally, I spotted the faint outline of a ladder leading up to a trapdoor. The map had led me here, a potential escape route. I climbed the ladder as quickly and quietly as I could, my hands slick with sweat. As I pushed the trapdoor open, I glanced back down into the tunnels one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance, watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I hauled myself up and slammed the trapdoors shut, collapsing onto the ground above. For now, I was safe. But the tunnels, the whispers, and the growls, they weren't going to let me go that easily. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. The tunnels twisted and turned like a serpent coiled beneath the earth, each step plunging me deeper into the unknown. The map I clutched was smudged with sweat, the ink fading under the damp and oppressive air. My flashlight flickered again, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel the tension thick in the air, a weight pressing against my chest as though the tunnels themselves were alive, anticipating my every move. The first sign that I was close to something monumental came when the narrow passage widened into a grand corridor. The walls, no longer rough and cracked, were smooth and etched with intricate carvings. Strange symbols covered every surface, glowing faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. The air grew heavier, tinged with a metallic scent that churned my stomach. At the end of the corridor, I saw it. A massive doorway, its edges lined with ornate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift under the beam of my flashlight. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, I could hear the faint hum of voices. Not whispers this time, but a steady chant, rhythmic and haunting. I crept forward, every step a battle between the need to know and the instinct to flee. When I pushed the door open just wide enough to peek inside, the sight before me was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. The central chamber was colossal, far larger than the mansion above. Its walls stretched high, vanishing into shadow, and at the center was an altar carved from black stone, its surface glistening as though freshly polished. Around the altar stood dozens of hooded figures, their faces obscured, each holding a lit candle that cast flickering, distorted shadows. Above the altar, suspended in midair, was an artifact that defied explanation. It pulsed with a faint glow, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid gold. The air around it seemed charged, humming with an energy that made my skin crawl. On the altar lay a massive tome, its pages yellowed and brittle. The figures chanted in unison, their voices low and guttural, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a physical force. I crouched behind a pillar, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing. From the group, a figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, with an undeniable air of authority. Even without seeing his face, I knew who it was. He raised his hands, and the chanting ceased, the silence that followed more deafening than the noise. His voice echoed through the chamber, low and commanding. "This is the heart of our power," he said, his words dripping with gravitas. "Here, in these depths, we secure the future. Fear binds them. Loyalty is bought with blood, and sacrifice sustains us." I pressed myself tighter against the pillar, barely daring to breathe. Diddy's speech continued, his words unveiling a horrifying truth. "These tunnels," he said, gesturing around him, "are not just for us. They connect us to them, the ones who control the narrative, who shape the world. And as long as we remain faithful, they grant us their favor." My blood turned to ice as his words sank in. The tunnels weren't just a hidden passage beneath the mansion. They were a network, a web of influence that extended far beyond these walls. This wasn't just about rituals or dark power plays. This was control on a scale I couldn't have fathomed. As Diddy continued, he gestured toward the altar. Names were spoken, names that made my stomach churn. These weren't just random people. They were celebrities, politicians, CEOs. I recognized several from the book I'd found, their faces etched into my memory. Each name carried a weight, a connection to scandals and disappearances that suddenly made horrifying sense. My mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. The rituals weren't symbolic, they were literal acts of binding. Blood sacrifices and oaths of loyalty ensured silence and complicity. This was how they maintained their grip on power, their ability to manipulate and control without question. I didn't have time to process it all before a new sound pierced the air, a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The hooded figures stirred, their heads turning sharply in unison. I froze, my heart pounding as one of them began walking in my direction. The figure's steps echoed loudly against the stone floor, each one sending a jolt of panic through my body. I backed away as quietly as I could, retreating deeper into the shadows. But my foot slipped on the slick floor. The sound was subtle, but it was enough. The figure turned, his movement sudden and unnatural. "Over there!" a voice shouted, and chaos erupted. I bolted, the hooded figures giving chase. The chamber became a blur as I sprinted back toward the corridor, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me, their footsteps grew louder, their shouts blending with the growls that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Using the map, I navigated the labyrinth, twisting and turning through passageways as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but the adrenaline kept me moving. At one point, I ducked into a narrow crevice, pressing myself against the cold stone as the footsteps passed by. My breathing was ragged, but I bit down the urge to gasp for air, praying they wouldn't find me. Just when I thought I was safe, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing my arm. I whipped around, ready to fight, but it wasn't one of them. It was the terrified staff member who had warned me earlier. "This way," he hissed, pulling me into a hidden passage. We ran together, the narrow tunnel opening into another chamber. He pushed a lever disguised as part of the wall, and a hidden door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading upward. "Go," he urged, his voice trembling. "Don't stop until you're out." I hesitated, but the sound of footsteps behind us spurred me forward. I climbed the staircase 2 steps at a time, the echoes of pursuit fading as I ascended. When I reached the top, I pushed open a heavy metal grate and tumbled out into the night air. For a moment I lay there, gasping for breath, the cool breeze a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the tunnels. But the relief was short-lived. The truth I had uncovered wasn't something I could forget or escape. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The cold night air bit into my skin as I stumbled away from the mansion. The sprawling estate loomed behind me, its grandeur now overshadowed by the horrors buried beneath it. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each step carrying me further from the nightmare I'd witnessed. But freedom wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined. Even as I put distance between myself and the tunnels, their presence clung to me. The weight of what I'd seen wasn't something I could simply leave behind. It wasn't just about Diddy or the mansion. It was about a network so vast and insidious that its reach extended far beyond what I'd thought possible. I stopped at the edge of the woods, crouching low to catch my breath. My mind replayed the night's events, the hooded figures, the glowing artifact, the sinister chants. I clutched the journal and map tightly against my chest, their significance more apparent than ever. These weren't just scraps of evidence, they were lifelines to a truth that needed to be exposed. But at what cost? Days turned into weeks as I slipped into hiding, moving from one dilapidated motel to another. My phone remained off, my interactions with the outside world reduced to the bare minimum. I lived in constant paranoia, the shadows on the walls and the creaks of old buildings feeling more like warnings than coincidences. The journal and map became my only companions. By day I pored over them, connecting the dots between the rituals I'd seen and the larger network they hinted at. By night, I barely slept, the faintest sounds jolting me awake. The tunnels beneath Diddy's mansion were just one piece of the puzzle. The map revealed connections to other estates, warehouses, private clubs, places where power was brokered and secrets were kept at unimaginable costs. One evening, as I sifted through the journal, a knock at my motel door froze me in place. My heart pounded as I grabbed the small knife I kept under the bed, inching toward the peephole. No one was there. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, I found only a single envelope on the floor, its stark white surface a chilling contrast to the dingy hallway. Inside was a note, written in the same elegant script as the one I'd found back at the mansion. "You can't hide forever. Run while you still can." I tore the note to shreds, but the message was clear. They knew where I was. The network's reach wasn't limited to the tunnels or the estate. It extended everywhere. The paranoia grew unbearable. Every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every shadowy figure lingering too long in an alley, felt like an impending threat. My nights were punctuated by strange calls from untraceable numbers, the silence on the other end more menacing than words could ever be. Despite the fear, I couldn't let it stop me. I knew too much. Keeping silent wasn't an option anymore. The journal's pages were a damning indictment of a system built on manipulation, control, and unspeakable rituals. Names and dates filled the margins, connecting dots that led to scandals, disappearances, and deaths. I'd stumbled onto something bigger than I could handle alone. But I wasn't completely alone. A single name, scribbled in the back of the journal, stood out: Marquez. It wasn't a name I recognized, but the accompanying notes suggested they were a journalist known for exposing corruption. The idea of reaching out to them was both terrifying and liberating. Sitting at the battered desk in my latest motel room, I opened my laptop for the first time since leaving the estate. My hands trembled as I typed the message, each keystroke feeling like a point of no return. "Dear Marquez, I have information that will expose a network of power and control beyond anything you've seen before. Enclosed are encrypted files containing details about rituals, tunnels, and individuals involved. This story could change everything, but it comes with risks. If you're interested, respond to this email with a secure channel. They're watching me, and I don't have much time." I hesitated before hitting send, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Once I sent this, there would be no going back. The room seemed to close in on me as I stared at the screen, my mind racing with doubts. What if Marquez was part of the network? What if this only brought them closer to finding me? But what if this was the only way to make the truth known? In the end, the decision wasn't mine alone. It was for every victim, every name in the journal, every life ruined by the network's insidious grasp. With a deep breath, I clicked send. The email disappeared into the void, and with it, so did my last shred of security. I sat back, exhaling shakily as the enormity of what I'd done sank in. The journal and map remained on the desk, silent reminders of the truth I'd uncovered. As the hours passed, I packed a small bag, preparing to move again. Staying in one place too long wasn't an option anymore. But this time, as I stepped into the night, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I didn't know what the future held, whether I'd expose the truth or vanish into the shadows like so many others. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't stop fighting. The glowing street lights cast long shadows on the pavement as I walked away, the journal tucked safely in my bag. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine revved, and I quickened my pace. The world was darker now, its secrets more terrifying than I'd ever imagined, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones we hear, they're the ones we live.